So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, over the last offseason, we've talked a lot about the rookie additions to this team, right? We've talked about everybody from the draft class. We've talked about just about everybody from the UDFA class, their successes through OTAs, through rookie minicamps, through mandatory minicamps, and of course, we will continue to follow these players through training camp, preseason, and into the regular season. But the question does have to be asked, with the Detroit Lions being such a talented roster, how many of these admittedly very talented rookies are actually going to end up making the final 53-man roster? How many of these talented rookies are going to end up being Detroit Lions come the regular season? Because despite the fact that they are all very talented, they all have a chance of being very successful in the NFL, the odds are that some of them just won't end up making the final roster over a lot of veterans and over a lot of playmakers that have already cemented their spots on the 2023 Detroit Lions. So today I wanted to take a look at all of the rookies the Lions have added over the last couple of months, take a look at how likely they are to actually end up making the final roster and being impactful on the 2023 Detroit Lions roster. So that is what we're going to be taking a look at today, starting off with the players that I would say are guarantees to make the roster, right? These are guys that have a 100% chance are likely going to be Detroit Lions in the 2023 season. And I would be genuinely shocked if any of these players did not make the final 53. Now, first off, we're going to take a look at Jahmyr Gibbs. Obviously, the 12th overall pick in the 2023 NFL Draft. Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a big play threat for the Detroit Lions. He's going to be a receiver. He's going to be a running back. He's going to be a dynamic offensive playmaker. And this guy will make the roster. A first-round pick has never not made the roster of an NFL team, and there is no question that he is going to be on the team, and there is no question that the Lions have a big role in mind for the Bama product they took 12th overall. Now, Jet Campbell is in a very similar boat. The 20th overall pick selected just 8 picks after Jahmyr Gibbs. He is going to be likely a starting off-ball linebacker with his coverage ability and run-stopping support, likely being linebacker 1, if not linebacker 2, by the end of 2023. Jet Campbell may actually get off to a slower start than a lot of people expect from the first-round rookie, but by the end of his first season, I expect Jet Campbell to be a phenomenal player, a starter on this defense, a leader on the defensive side of the ball for the Detroit Lions, and there is a 100% chance that he makes the active roster for the Detroit Lions this season. Sam Laporta is a similar boat to them, not necessarily being a first-round pick, but being the second pick of the second round. The 34th overall pick from, again, the University of Iowa has been a standout at OTAs and been a standout throughout minicamp. He's already taking first-team reps as the starting tight end and already showing that he can be an explosive, big play role player in the Detroit Lions' already high-scoring offense. Sam Laporta, I think, is maybe the most natural receiving tight end in this class and arguably the best yak tight end in this class. He's a player that once the ball is in his hands, nobody does it quite like him. Nobody picks up extra yards. Nobody runs after the catch quite like Sam Laporta does at the tight end position, which is a big reason he was taken with the 34th overall selection. Now, Brian Branch, again, is a player that I would guarantee will make the roster. The 45th overall pick in the 2023 NFL Draft, a player that was projected to go in the first round, a player that is looked at by many as the steal of round 2 or the steal of the entire draft even, and he's a versatile playmaker with great instincts, again, standing out at OTAs, standing out at mini camps, showing off his great instincts and playmaking ability. He is going to make the roster, as is Hendon Hooker, likely the quarterback of the future, or at least that is the plan right now. Hendon Hooker may not be ready by week 1. Hendon Hooker may not play in the preseason. He is very early in his recovery process and very early into throwing the football again after tearing his ACL last November. but he will make the roster, whether he starts the season on the PUP list, whether he starts the season as that quarterback 3 because of the new rule and is able to practice and kind of slowly ease his way back in. Hendon Hooker will be somewhere in the Detroit Lions facility in 2023 and likely for a very long time, as the Lions likely view him as the QB of the future. Now, Broderick Martin, the 96th overall selection in the 2023 draft, was selected to be the starting nose tackle of the Detroit Lions, allowing Aleem McNeil to move from nose over to more of a 3-technique pass rushing situation. Now, Broderick Martin, again, like Hendon Hooker, may not start on day one, but the Lions very clearly have a role in mind for the nose tackle out of Western Kentucky, and they view him as a potential cornerstone nose tackle for the Detroit Lions for a very long period of time in the future. And then I think Colby Sorsdale will end up making the roster as well. He's a player that was a 5th round pick, the 152nd overall pick in the NFL draft, a player that has stood out at minicamp, stood out at OTAs, stood out at rookie minicamp, a player that has impressed coaches over and over and over again. And in the absence of some veterans, has even taken some first team reps with the first team offensive line. Although with the injuries and the off days, it wasn't really the first team offensive line, but it does show that he is beating out a lot of the other depth guards for that particular playing time when the starters are not available. I would expect Colby Sorsdale to start the season likely as the right guard 2, right behind Halapalobi Vaitai, and of course Graham Glasgow being kind of that center guard switch. I expect Colby Sorsdale to be that, except for the right guard, right tackle rotation, as he has experience playing both at the collegiate level. Now, these 7 players I expect to fully make the roster. They will be on the final 53. They will impact the Detroit Lions in 2023, and they will end up making the roster. However, there's a lot of other rookies that haven't quite been talked about as much, and players that I wouldn't say are guaranteed, but I would say are relatively likely to make the roster in 2023. Taking a look at these players, Antoine Green is one of those players that I would feel very confident saying he will end up making the roster as likely the wide receiver 5 or the wide receiver 6. He's a really impressive field stretcher, much like the rest of the rookie class. He has been really impressive throughout OTAs and minicamp. He's been making a lot of big plays with a great connection with Nate Sudfeld as well as Adrian Martinez, but the Lions wide receiver position is a little bit deep, right? You have Khalif Raymond, you have Amon-Ra St. Brown, you have Marvin Jones Jr., you have Josh Reynolds, you have Tom Kennedy, you have Jameson Williams when he ends up returning. But due to the suspension of Jameson Williams, I think that opens up a spot for Antoine Green to make this roster as the final wide receiver and eventually get a role throughout the first 6 weeks of the NFL season because of his field stretching ability. I think he is a younger, less polished version of what Marvin Jones was coming out of the University of California all those seasons ago. And I think he can eventually develop into a very similar role and archetype to what Marvin Jones has been in the NFL for the last number of seasons, going with the Bengals, the Lions, the Jaguars, and of course now being back in Detroit. I would feel very confident saying that he makes the active roster by week 1, but I think it is a little bit skeptical whether or not he will remain on the roster after Jameson Williams returns or whether he will be demoted down to the practice squad. Now, Stephen Gilmore and Starling Thomas are 2 players that I think are very much intertwined. I think that their fates on this team are going to be very much reliable on each other. I think one of these players is going to make the active 53-man roster, and I believe one of these players will be sent down to the practice squad and will be waived by the Detroit Lions, eventually added back to the practice squad, if not eventually picked up by another team entirely. But they are both very similar players. They were both standout cornerbacks at college. They were both players in less than ideal situations, right? They were both group of 5 cornerbacks, but both players that were very good at the group of 5 level. They both have shown some special teams versatility. They both have shown the ability to have pass breakups, interceptions, and takeaways through 7-on-7 and 11-on-11 drills. They are both players that I think can be cornerbacks in the NFL and both make active rosters, but because of the cornerback depth on this team, I do believe one of them, unfortunately, is going to be moved to the practice squad, which is really unfortunate because they're both really good players, and the likelihood that one of them gets signed through waivers is probably pretty high. Now, Mohamed Ibrahim is a very particular case. Mohamed Ibrahim is a player that led the Big Ten in rushing in 2023 and has been a big-time player in a big-time program for a number of years. He was a freshman All-American. He's been a first-team All-American, a first-team all-time Big Ten player. He is a great football player and has been great for he has been great for the Minnesota Gophers over the last couple of seasons, but the Lions typically carry 4 running backs, and that fourth running back usually comes from the practice squad. It's usually an elevated practice squad guy that comes up every single week and plays for the Detroit Lions, but doesn't quite stay on the active 53. Last year, that was Justin Jackson, a player that was on the practice squad originally until Craig Reynolds got hurt, and then he got moved up, and the Lions activated a fourth running back under him after he was moved to the 53 and Reynolds was moved to the injury reserve list. I believe that is going to be the role Muhammad Ibrahim has. I don't think the Lions necessarily need his skill set, but he is a good skill set to have on the roster. He reminds me a lot of what Jamal Williams was able to do for the Detroit Lions a season ago, and I do think that if he does get waived, there's a high likelihood he does get picked up by another team, but there's also, I think, a relatively good chance that he makes the Detroit Lions practice squad because he is older. He's an older prospect. He went undrafted for a reason. He's a player that doesn't have great long speed, but if you're looking for a goal line back, if you're looking for a short yardage back, if you're looking for an RB4 and a productive RB4 to take some of the load off Montgomery and Gibbs and Reynolds, he could be the perfect running back for them. I think he will be the Detroit Lions running back 4, whether that means he stays on the active roster because they construct their team a little differently this year, or he gets moved down to the practice squad and elevated multiple weeks in a row to be that RB4. Now, Adrian Martinez is a player that a lot of people don't think is going to end up making the roster. And I disagree. I think that Adrian Martinez is a player the Lions have been very interested in for a very long time. He's a player that took a top 30 visit. He's a player the Lions interviewed at his pro day. He's a player that the Detroit Lions have talked to several times throughout the pre-draft process. And somebody the Lions, if you went back and looked in hindsight, he was always going to be a Detroit Lion, right? If he was in risk of being drafted in the 7th round, the Lions would have drafted him in the 7th round over Antoine Green. If he was, at risk of being taken away, the Lions were going to give him a bigger signing bonus than somebody else, right? He is a player the Lions very clearly wanted on the roster and was very clearly going to be on the roster at some point. Now, whether that is as the quarterback 3, if Hendon Hooker is healthy, or whether that is a practice squad player if Hendon Hooker is not healthy, that is, of course, up to be determined, right? I don't know if he's necessarily going to be the quarterback 3 on that third quarterback rule that they made. I don't know if he's going to make the practice squad as kind of just a practice squad guy. But I do have a high confidence in saying that Adrian Martinez will be a Detroit Lion. I don't think he's going to be taken off of waivers. He holds numerous Nebraska passing records. He is a great playmaker, and I think that playmaking ability is exactly what the Detroit Lions want in a backup quarterback, if not a third string quarterback, or even a situational rushing quarterback for the Detroit Lions throughout his career. I think it's very likely that he ends up making the roster on the practice squad or as the QB3 of this roster because he simply brings a different element, a different playmaking element to the Detroit Lions that they don't currently have at the QB position. Now, Brandon Joseph is a player from Notre Dame that I have been very high on. I had a 4th round grade on Brandon Joseph, the safety from Notre Dame, and thought that he could have been drafted anywhere from the early hundreds all the way through the draft. For one reason or another, he ended up going undrafted, but has been making some plays at OTAs and has been making some plays at minicamp. But despite being a very talented ball hawking coverage safety, I do think he ends up making the practice squad due to the abundance of depth that the Detroit Lions have at safety. Kirby Joseph, Tracy Walker, CJ Gardner-Johnson, Brian Branch, Ifeatu Melifonwu are all players that are going to likely make the roster as slot cornerbacks / safeties. And I think it leaves a very slim margin for Brandon Joseph to make the active roster despite being a really good playmaker through the air. But if he makes it through waivers, I do believe he will be a really good depth piece on the Detroit Lions secondary, on the practice squad, a player that they can stash away, a player that they very clearly liked through the pre-draft process as they brought him in as an undrafted free agent. And I think a player that could eventually develop into a depth safety or even a potential starter if some injuries happen to arise. Now, these are not the only rookies I think can make the roster, as there are 4 more players that I think have a chance, but I wouldn't say are necessarily guaranteed. Now, the last 4 players we're going to talk about today are going to start off with Connor Galvin. Now, Connor Galvin is a big big player from the University of Baylor, I believe 6'8" offensive tackle from the University of Baylor, a tremendous size, tremendous pass blocking upside, but a very raw and very unready NFL prospect. He's a player, I think, in a very similar mold to Abini Azie, a player that is big, is long, has all the physical tools and traits, but has a long way to go. I think this is a player that ends up making the practice squad and ends up probably sitting on the practice squad for a couple of years, might not even get elevated, but the tools and the upside are reason enough to keep him around. Dylan Drummond, the UDFA from Eastern Michigan, is a player that has stood out at rookie minicamp, a player that was originally not signed out of undrafted free agency, but a player that was originally just brought into rookie camp, a player that outperformed other UDFA wide receivers, a player that ended up getting a contract signed, a player that has improved through OTAs and improved through rookie minicamp and mandatory minicamp, and a player that every single time he is on the field continues to improve over and over and over again. And I think the Lions are going to keep him around, maybe not on the active roster, but as a Tom Kennedy-esque player, as a guy that continues to make the practice squad year after year after year. And when injuries arise, you can go, hey, okay, we're going to bring up Dylan Drummond. He's going to be a guy that's just going to play for us when we need him, and he's going to be kind of that easy stash player on the practice squad every single year. Now, Corey Durden is a player that I think can be a rotational pass rusher for the Detroit Lions, but very similar to Brandon Joseph, the abundance of depth at the defensive tackle position means he probably isn't going to make the active roster. I think he will be a practice squad guy, a player that the Lions really like, gave a signing bonus to, but will end up making the practice squad when it's all said and done. And then Isaac Darkangelo, the linebacker UDFA from the University of Illinois. I think he has good instincts. I think he's a good run. I think he's a good pass rusher. I think he's a good run stopper. I think the Lions are very interested in keeping him around. But again, due to the depth at the linebacker position currently, I don't think the undrafted free agent is going to end up making the roster unless he is able to beat out Jalen Reeves-Maybin for that fifth and final linebacker spot. But I do think because of the special teams versatility and the veteran leadership on the special teams, I do think I'll give the slight edge to Jalen Reeves-Maybin. So with that being said, that leaves the Detroit Lions with 16 rookies making the roster, 8 of whom will make the active roster or will be elevated every week, with 8 players that will make the practice squad of the 16 total practice squad spots. As I said, the Lions added a ton of talent this year through their rookie acquisitions, and I think many of them will impact the Detroit Lions either this coming season or somewhere further down the line. But with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below. Leave your comments on which rookies you think are going to make the roster, which rookies you think are going to make the practice squad, and which players are going to have a big impact on the Detroit Lions in 2023. I'd be very curious what you guys have to say and what players you think will end up making the roster. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions!